Hello everyone and welcome back to another album review. In this video I'm going to review Broken Gargoyles by Diamanda Galás. Diamanda Galás is a name that has many years in the music industry, going from back in the early 80s, so it's definitely really nice to see her making new albums after all of those years. It has been almost 5 years since we got her latest release, which was All The Way, an album that I certainly enjoyed. It had some really nice aspects to it, but it certainly didn't mark itself as one of the more significant works of Diamanda Galás. Some of the directions of this album didn't really make it one of her most compelling works. It had more of a minimal sense at some parts and it felt more of like a live album, which for me, I usually don't tend to look for albums that have this mostly live aesthetic towards them. However, for the case of Diamanda Galás, I believe that it makes somewhat of a sense, as there's a big portion of the performances at her works be done in a way that would feel somewhat fitting for creating this live aesthetic to them. Now, this brand new album over here seems to go into many more different directions, it being much more varied in comparison to what we saw with All The Way. This album over here seems to go into many different sounds and directions that we've seen from Diamanda Galás all over the years. For the most part, we're talking about an album that shares many elements that are pretty similar with what we've heard from Diamanda Galás beforehand, but for the most part this album feels like a combination of many different aspects that we've seen from multiple different albums of Diamanda Galás. With the exception of directions like neoclassical dark wave, we don't really get paths like this over here, but as you would expect, we still have the dark atmosphere, the intensity with the vocals of Diamanda Galás going into this opera and sometimes spoken word and poetry direction, which is an element that we see with a big portion of this album, and I honestly really like the way this album is being handled, with how we get this heavily experimental album that goes into many different phases and sides with two quite lengthy and unpredictable songs, which definitely share the elements that would make the sound of Diamanda Galás so much appealing. If you are familiar with some of her 80s works, you basically still manage to get some of the same aesthetics over here. This album is absolutely terrifying, with its sounds, the screams, the screeches, the dark atmosphere that it provides. It is like a really haunting album, and Diamanda Galás has managed throughout all of those years to definitely create some of the most horrifying albums to ever exist in media, in my opinion, and Broken Gargoyles is not that much of an exception. It is another album that is really disturbing with its sounds and just having this mysterious and frightening tone, and it's really impressive how her vocals still manage to hold up this well after all of those years. The vocal performances over here are once again absolutely spectacular. There is no denying that. Now, what's interesting about the structure of the tracks, especially the very first one, is that while you have many different elements of her sounds being put together, they're not really done in a way that feels that much chaotic or that much distracting. The way this album operates for the most part is that you basically have just very few elements being played together, and then you have multiple transitions and different phases towards the songs. You never really have many elements being played at the same time, or just something that would make you feel really overwhelmed with sounds. If you take those segments individually, we're talking about minimal stuff for the most part, and all of those different phases towards the song range from opera to sound poetry to haunting monotone drone passages to piano sections to electroacoustic elements to some weird vocal manipulations at some parts, and all of those different elements manage to have the same dark and disturbing atmosphere to them, which I find it to be certainly pretty intriguing. With that being said, due to the very experimental nature of this album, I don't really feel there needs to be further explanation or information being brought out, because due to its nature and how it operates, it mostly serves as an album that you have to listen for yourselves. It feels sort of pointless just to pinpoint many different aspects and phases throughout the songs and what makes them really appealing. There were certainly parts that stood out for me over others, but in an album like this, I don't really feel that information and stuff like this are that much of an importance. What I'd say is that I find the variation variation of the very first track to be more compelling in comparison to the second one, which seemed to be a somewhat more minimal and straightforward track without having that many different segments and that much of a variation to it. It is a track that feels more straightforward when it comes to some approaches of like opera and spoken word sections. There were some more noisy and intense parts in comparison to the first song, which I find this to be a pretty intriguing addition with some of those sounds being provided to the second track, but as an overall thing, its lack of variation in comparison to the first one didn't really make this track that much of a more compelling experience. However, both of the tracks managed to keep the dark and haunting atmosphere that is the main point of appeal for the sound of Diamanda Galás throughout all of those years. But the thing with this album, and the main criticism that I have at the end of the day, is that it ends up feeling quite predictable, in the sense that if you are already familiar with albums of Diamanda Galás in the past, you're not necessarily getting something that much different or that much unique over here. You basically get different portions of stuff that we've heard from Diamanda Galás being done before in the past. Not necessarily that much better, because once again the performances over here are spectacular, but this familiarity with the sound of Diamanda Galás makes this album not really feeling that much exceptional, because indeed if you have heard previous stuff from Diamanda Galás, you're gonna be really satisfied with the results of this album. However, you won't find something that would make this particular release feel exceptional in comparison to what we got with some of her stuff in the 80s, which for back in the day would sound much more revolutionary and ahead of their time. What we get with Broken Gargoyles is undoubtedly a really well done album, but not necessarily one that reaches the spotlight in Diamanda Galás' catalog, which is also quite understandable. It's not an easy task after you've managed to create such powerful works from like back in the 80s. It's really hard after all of those years to come up with something that would manage to surpass or reach those works, and it doesn't really need to. For what it is, Broken Gargoyles is still a pretty solid album, one that Diamanda Galás fans would certainly find pretty enjoyable. At the end of the day, there are still many solid aspects out of this album. I'm gonna give Broken Gargoyles a 7+ out of 10. What's your opinion on this album? Like it, dislike it, why? And what do you want to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.